Alrighty, in this video what we're going to do is we are going to get MSDeploy set up inside of our project so that we can properly synchronize our folders with our target folders, and our folders being our Buzz MMO server master and server region, and our target folders being the place in Photon that they need to go. So again, the build task that we're going to be implementing is going to be our deploy Photon build task. And what that again needs to do is it really needs to send off these two builds into a proper location somewhere on our hard drive. Now there's a variety of tools that we can use to synchronize folders, but in this case, what we're going to be doing is MSDeploy, and the reason why we're using it is it's a little bit more powerful, and it'll be useful for both copying folders to local machines as well as copying folders to remote machines, because we're going to be using MSDeploy for deploying our website in addition to this. In this particular case, on our local machine, we are going to be copying to a local folder on somewhere on our hard drive, and on the production box, quote unquote, we're going to be copying it to another local folder on its hard drive, but that won't always necessarily be the case. So I want to use a tool that we can take advantage of to deploy both locally and remotely to other boxes. Now there's a variety of deployment tools. You can look at like Octopus Deploy and so on. You could just use FTP, you could use Xcopy, but again, we're going to be using MSDeploy. So what I need to do is I need to install MSDeploy, but then what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy the executables into a local folder in our repository so that we can use MSDeploy on computers that don't necessarily have it fully installed. And that might be the case of your continuous integration server. MSDeploy also comes with some tools that allow us to perform syncing remotely over IIS, and those tools are going to be necessary for when we do our deployment of our website. So we're going to want to install this entire package, the entire WebDeploy package, on our machine. We're going to want to install it locally as well so that we can test our building of our website locally in addition to remotely once we install this on our production machine. So we come over here, just go ahead and grab this URL, isnet downloads Microsoft Web Deploy, or search for MSDeploy or Web Deploy. MSDeploy and Web Deploy are the same thing. The executable is called MSDeploy, but the package is called Web Deploy. And then we're going to want to install this, but I'm not going to hit install this extension. Instead, I'm going to say view additional downloads. The reason I'm doing this is because if you install this using Microsoft Web Platform, you're not going to get all of the tools required in order to do IIS deployments. In order to do IIS deployments, you have to have certain additional components installed for managing IIS websites remotely. But in this case, we're going to have to do that through the installer, the actual MSI package, rather than the WebPI package, because the WebPI package won't install all the components that we need it to. So I'm going to go over here and click on the x86, which is going to download WebDeploy AMD64. And we're going to wait a year for it to, it says 0 seconds. Oh, there we go. Then I'm going to click on this and it'll say, welcome to the Microsoft Web Deploy 3.5 Setup Wizard. I'm going to hit next, accept the licensing terms. I'm not going to sign up for that. Then here's what's important. You're going to have to want to click custom or complete. I'm going to go ahead and click custom to show you guys what's missing out of the default installation. What's missing out of the default installation is the IIS deployment handler and the configure for non-administrator deployments, the management services, delegation UI, and the remote agent server. So you're going to need all of these installed in order to do remote deployments. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to have all of these be installed, and I'm going to hit next, and then I'm going to hit install. So once this completes, it's going to install, I'll show you where it's going to install these this package on, but then we're going to copy it in locally into our repository so that we can perform deployments by just doing a clone of our repository. We don't have any dependency on WebDeploy being installed. Unfortunately, WebDeploy will have to be installed through this installer on the website server, on the server that handles the website, because we need those additional tools such as the integration with IIS. Now this installed, I'm going to go ahead and minimize this, and I'm going to open up this solution in my File Explorer, in which case I will get this folder opened up. And so this should be a familiar folder. This is our source folder, and I'm going to back up into our root of our repository so that we see these. Next up, I'm going to open up another folder, and I'm going to locate our web deploy. So our web deploy is going to be under program files if we install the 64-bit and we're on a 64-bit operating system, or it'll be in program files x86 if you installed the 32-bit version on a 64-bit operating system. So we're going to jump into program files. We're going to scroll down and find IIS. Inside of IIS, we will see Microsoft Web Deploy version 3. And then we'll have a bunch of this stuff. So we'll have our web delegation, deployment, PowerShell integration, tracing, MSDeploy, MSDeploy config, and all of this fun stuff. What I'm going to do is I'm going to copy in the EN folder and all of these files. And I'm just going to hit Control-C because we're going to be copying this into a local folder in our repository. Then I'm going to jump back into our repository and then open up the lib folder, and I'm going to create a new folder called MSBuild. Once I'm inside of MSBuild, I'm going to hit paste, which will paste all of these programs and DLLs into our MSBuild folder underneath our lib folder. Now that we've done that, we can now reference MSBuild in a relative path in our build script as opposed to having to reference it in an absolute path, which would cause potential issues. So I'm going to move that off to the side, and let's take a look at how we would copy our Photon servers to our proper folders. Well, the first thing that we need to do is we need to know how exactly we're going to locate the proper folders to copy it into. And now this is going to depend on a variety of different circumstances, as for example, where, well, it's only going to depend on one circumstance, which is where you have Photon installed. And so if you recall, I have Photon installed right here, and I'm going to want to copy those folders into my Buzz MMO server master bin and my Buzz MMO server region bin. Now you might be asking, why is it that I'm writing a build task for deploying Photon if these folders are already set up properly, in that when I perform a build, these folders get populated with the build artifacts? So why am I doing this? Why am I adding this extra step? Well, again, this Buzz MMO build.proj file, this entire MSBuild project, the purpose of it is to be executed by our continuous integration machine. So you can think of what we're doing as creating an explicit task for performing the operation of deploying Photon, which will work on any computer as opposed to just our computer. So to do that, we will need to know the location of where the deploy folder of Photon lives. We'll need to know this path, because this path is what's going to be used to know where to copy the files into. We're also going to need to know where our files actually get built into when we perform the build. And fortunately, that's very easy for us, because we know that when we perform a build in debug mode or release mode, let me go ahead and open this folder again. Where are you? Open in File Explorer. We know that when we perform a debug build or a release build, they will get built into Buzz MMO server master bin debug or bin release. So our goal is to synchronize this folder with this folder. And of course, it'll be slightly different when we do our actual building, but that's okay. It'll be slightly different. The paths will be different when we're doing our building on our continuous integration server, which means we need a variable. We need to know where this folder is. What I'm going to do here, though, is I'm not going to supply a default value for this variable. Instead, I'm going to have this variable passed in as a parameter into our build script. So that means when we set up our continuous integration server, we simply need to provide it with a path to copy files into. Okay, so we want to copy Photon servers to proper folders, and we want to use MSDeploy. So basically all we're going to do is we're going to do an exec, and that exec is going to invoke our MSDeploy, and it's going to pass in the proper flags. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to say exec, and then exec requires that I pass in a command. And what's the command going to be? Well, the command's going to be backup lib msdeploy msdeploy.exe. So that is the command that we're going to pass in. So if you remember, our build script starts right here in source, because buzzmmo build.proj. We have to go back one folder, up into lib, up into this should be msdeploy, not msbuild, sorry about that. Up into msdeploy, and then msdeploy.exe. So now that we have that referenced, we have to now pass in the variables that we need in order to perform a local file synchronization. So remember, MSDeploy provides a variety of different ways that we can, they're called providers, and a provider is something that allows us to perform some sort of operation. And those operations can vary. They could be synchronizing local folders, to synchronizing remote folders, to synchronizing websites, to configuring IIS, to executing SQL, and you can even write your own providers if you wanted to. But in this case, this command, we're going to be using sync. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say -verb: sync, which is going to say we're going to want to synchronize two folders. Now, synchronize is a lot more involved than just copying, because synchronize will actually remove files on the target that don't exist in the source, which is the behavior that we want. Let's say that, for example, one day we decide to remove a particular DLL dependency on our server master. By using a synchronize, what we're doing is we're saying that when we perform this deployment, we want to remove any file that isn't in existence in our source file. And this is a very important thing, because without this flag, without using a synchronize and instead using a copy, there are a lot of real-world scenarios where you'll reach a, not an undefined state, but an invalid state on your deployment target. Now we need to specify the source files. So I'm going to say -source: content path, which is going to be the path to where I want to consider the source files. And I'm going to wrap this in quotes, single quotes. And then I'm going to say msbuild, msbuild this file directory, which is the variable that represents the directory that the build script is in. And I'm going to want to say /buzzmmo.server. Let's do master first. So buzzmmo server master. And then I'm going to want to say /bin. Then I'm going to want to say /build config, because we want bin debug or bin release, depending on what configuration we are building in. And that actually completes our content path. So this path will reference buzzmmo server master bin debug or bin release, which is what we want. Now we have to do our destination path. So I'll say dest: content path equals, and then inside single quotes, now I want to pass in where I want this to be deployed to. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say Photon deploy folder, which is a variable that we haven't defined yet, but we will define it when we invoke this command, both from the command line and from our build tool. And then I'm going to say /buzzmmo server master /bin, because that is the directory that we want to synchronize with. But we want to do one more thing. And that is, if we look at our bin folder in Photon, you'll notice this cache folder appeared. Now this cache folder, it's very important that we do not override the contents of this, because these are things that the Photon itself is going to be referencing and holding handles open into during the execution of our Photon application. So I really don't want to delete anything in cache. The default behavior is going to be that since cache doesn't exist in our source folder, it'll be removed from our destination folder. But that is not the behavior that I actually want. What I want is for this cache folder to be effectively ignored. So what I can do is I can provide another flag into MSDeploy, and I can say -skip :directory equals // cache money. By saying skip directory equals / cache money, we're saying that we don't want to perform any synchronizations against a folder named cache. And that's the behavior that we want. We'll be using the skip directory quite a lot for things like folders that contain uploads and folders that contain temporary files. For example, imagine synchronizing a website build with a website on a remote server. Well, what's going to happen there is you're not going to want the files that are created by the web application, such as uploads, to be deleted, because obviously those uploads won't exist in the source path. So we'll use the skip directory flag for that. And that should pretty much wrap up deploying our master server. So before we write the code to deploy our region server, let's test this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up my Visual Studio command prompt, my developer command prompt for Visual Studio 2012, and then I'm going to cd into the path that contains my MS build script. So I'll cd into this, and I'll switch over to the F drive. And then I'm going to say MSDeploy space buzzmmo build.proj /t : and we'll call this, I believe I called this task, this target deploy Photon. So we'll say /t : deploy Photon /p : Photon deploy folder equals, and then instead of quotes, I'm going to pass in the deploy folder for Photon. And so my deploy folder is going to be f:/software /Photon -version 3 -4 -22 /deploy. Then I'm going to hit enter, and we get MSDeploy, or whoops, I mixed up MSDeploy and MSBuild again, didn't I? The command is MSBuild, not MSDeploy. Hit enter, and we get some errors. We get the command lib MSDeploy exited with code 909. Let's go ahead and see what happened here. So we have lib ... is not recognized as an internal or external command, operable program, or bat file. So it wasn't able to execute this command, probably because of two reasons, or no, probably because of, probably wanted to do ... like that. I might have to do an absolute path to this, unfortunately. But let's try doing our backslashes instead of forward slashes. Again, I really like forward slashes, but let's try backslashes first. And if this doesn't work, we'll use an absolute path. Okay, now we got a different error. So I think that is good. What we're getting here is cannot read configuration file due to insufficient privileges. So it's requiring that we're running in admin mode. So let's go ahead and figure out how we can fix it. And what we're seeing here is an actual foreshadowing of an issue that we're going to run into on our actual build server. What's going on here is that MSDeploy requires access to a particular configuration file, and that configuration file right now is locked down on my machine to only being accessible by administrator. There are a couple different ways we can handle this. First of all, we could elevate our developer command prompt for Visual Studio 2012, or we can go into that file and change its permissions to be readable by my current user account. I really don't want to execute MSDeploy on my local machine as an administrator. I would rather execute it as my unelevated Nelson account. So what I'm going to do is I will change the permissions of this particular file. Now, when we go ahead and do this inside of our continuous integration server, we're going to have to do the same thing, but we're going to be adding permissions to a different user account. I believe the one we're using is network services is what we're going to be using for Team City, or maybe we'll create an entirely new user for Team City. But fortunately, giving my local user account read access to this file isn't going to be a particularly big security risk, and the reason is that this account is technically an admin account already. It just needs UAC permission to do certain things. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add an explicit permission on this file to be accessible by my Nelson account without elevation. That doesn't pose a security risk because honestly, the file, I mean, we can take a look at the file. It's located under C Windows System 32 inetserv, so inetserv config. And this folder says you do not have permission to access this folder. I'm just going to hit continue, and we're going to see our administration config, application config, and redirection config. So if we open up some of these files, and take a look at them, what we're looking for is anything that is particularly so we do have it looks like we have a key on my local machine, which I now have on video, but that's fine, that's my local machine. So yeah, we have some information that we don't necessarily want to be accessible from outside developers if this was a production machine. Being my development machine, I could care less. Now that I've given myself access to this folder, I do believe this will give me read access to, actually it gives me full control over these particular things. I want to change that. I'm going to right-click config, go to properties, and I'm going to give my Nelson Lackey account just read access to this folder, not write access. So I'm going to disallow full control, disallow modify, list folder contents, read, and disallow write on my Nelson Lackey. So hit OK. Do I want to continue? Yes. It doesn't like those folders, but that should be fine. Schema and export should both be folders that I don't care about. Let's go try and execute that command again, and we get another error. We say object of type content path and path cannot be created. So it doesn't like our. So now we've fixed that error. So now that we have proper permissions to that folder, it doesn't like my content path, and perhaps it doesn't like it because I probably misspelled msbuild this file directory. And I'm using forward slashes again when I should be using backslashes. So I'm going to change all my forward slashes to backslashes. Actually, no, the reason is it's the destination content path, I believe. Is it? Or is it the source? It is... Yeah, okay, so what's going on here is I never provided my... Or I did provide my Photon deploy folder, didn't I? Let's see if I spelled that correctly. Photon deploy folder. Let's go here, and I'm just going to take this and paste this directly in here so I'm sure that my spelling is correct. We still get an error saying that oh, derp. Why did I quote? I shouldn't have quoted the Photon deploy folder. Those quotes are being replicated in. If we look at the output, we will see that what it's trying to do is say source content path equals blah, destination content path equals empty quote, then blah, then quote. So yeah, that's the problem right there. Let's hit enter. And now we get, now the destination looks correct, but it's possible that my source path is not correct. Let's see what the error is specifically. It says site buzz MMO server master does not exist. Yeah. That's because these source and destination paths require absolute paths, and they do that because you can pass in a variety of different kinds of paths into this, such as IIS sites, URLs, and all that fun stuff. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to make sure that msbuild this file directory is actually spelled correctly, which it didn't have a capital M, which I was pretty sure this stuff was case insensitive, but let's go ahead and see what happens. Okay, we get a different error. That means progress. So could not find file Visual Studio 3D Buzz MMO class Buzz MMO source Buzz MMO server master bin debug. Could not find file. Well, I'm not trying to deploy a file so much as I'm trying to deploy a folder. So I wonder if that double slash right there is causing problems. So I'm going to remove the slash that was delineating msbuild this file directory with that. And there we go. So yeah, basically what we're using MSDeploy in this particular instance, we're using it as a glorified folder synchronization tool. And as you see, it's intelligently updating this stuff. It's saying updating file, and so on. And it's not adding files or removing files because it's properly synchronizing. It noticed that 2 files were different, or 3 files were different. It only updated those files and it didn't waste time copying other files. So that's one of the cool things about MSDeploy. Okay, so now that we've done that, let's go ahead and deploy our region server. So I'm going to come back down here to deploy Photon, or up to here to deploy Photon. And I'm just going to type this out. I'm going to type this out just slowly without copying and pasting so that I make sure that everybody's following along. So I'm going to say // backslash, not forward slash, lib msdeploy msdeploy.exe space -verb sync. Our source content path is going to equal, in quotes, ms with capital MS build this file directory without a slash buzzmmo.server.region /bin /build config, which will be debug or it'll be release. Then I want to say dest content path equals, and scroll over here, I'm going to say, inside of quotes, I'm going to say Photon deploy folder /buzzmmo.server.mat or region /bin, and then I'm going to say space skip directory / cache money, and remove that erroneous dot that appeared at the end of the line. So what this should do is this should synchronize both our master server and our region server. And in the future, if you wanted to deploy to a remote site, you could do so. You just have to change these parameters up a little bit. But we're just wanting to go with the simplest solution that works for our scenario in this particular case, just to get things moving. Okay, so now that we have that all done, let's come back here and let's do our build. And as you see, we do get 0 added, 0 deleted, 0 updated for our first deployment to our master server. Then our second deployment said 3 updated and 0 added, 0 deleted. Let's go ahead and run that again, and we should see 0 added, 0 deleted, 0 updated on everything, meaning our build and our debug build and our deployment of our debug build are the same. Let's go ahead and hit space and add another /p:/env equals prod. Let's see what happens. If we do an env equals prod, we get a region warning. That's fine. You can ignore these warnings about the interop assembly for when dealing with the Photon host interfaces. That's fine. But as you see, when we do a debug or a release build, we get 9 updated and 9 updated on both projects. So you see it's updating the appropriate folders and properly synchronizing them. Let's finish this off with a quick dev build, which will do a debug build and a debug deployment. Okay, I mean, that pretty much wraps up MS Build for deploying to local files or local directories. When we go and actually turn this into a proper CI environment, when we have Team City configured, we'll be specifying the Photon deploy folder that's local to that. Again, by tweaking some of the parameters, we can do MS deploys against remote machines, but we're going to be dealing with that in the next video when we talk about deploying our website using MSDeploy or web deploy. And we'll also probably talk about how we can perform our database migrations as well, which is really important. But I think for now, that pretty much wraps this video up. We have one more target to write, and once we write this target, our build system will be completely automated, and we'll be able to actually put this into a real production environment. So we'll see you guys in the next video.